Hello, so good afternoon, everybody. So we will start this press conference. I see that we have a very good mix of a few of our industrial members. We have people from several European institutions, and of course we have people from the press. So before giving the floor to Pierre for the annual release of our facts and figure, perhaps just a few words of introduction. First, of course, I really want to thank all industry participants that have actually answered our questionnaire, and those industry are not only Eurospace members, but all the people from industry who have provided us with the data that actually allow us to release those annual facts and figures. Of course, I will thank Pierre, who is research director at Eurospace. For those of you who do not know him yet, Pierre is a very well-known figure in the super specialized community of space economists, sorry, and I'm talking about the ones who actually know what they are talking about. And we used to say in Eurospace that the facts and figures are really the key foundation of what we do as a trade association, because it allows both to inform the institution about the situation of the sector, but also to illustrate our policy-related message with transparent and verifiable information. And in a time actually where European decision makers insist, and rightly so, about non-dependence, and we do believe that having access to a non-dependent source of transparent information is key, especially when we note the spectacular amount of fantasies and confusion that sometimes reign in the sector of space economics, coming from banks or external consultancies. So what Pierre will present today is, well, the result of several months of analysis based on the information that has been gathered through our questionnaire, through our methodology, and of course through the data that have been sent to us by industry. So Pierre, the floor is yours, and already congratulations for this new release of the facts and figures.
Thank you very much, Olivier, for the introduction. So indeed, I will be sharing with you today the main findings of our annual survey. We produce every year the Eurospace Facts and Figures report. So let me jump into the presentation so that you can actually get a view of what we're going to talk about today. And of course, so I think now that you can see my screen. Thank you for confirming this, Nadir. So let me jump to the beginning and do a few introductory remarks. Let me put this in full screen for more visibility. Okay, so every year we publish the annual Facts and Figures report. So this is the 27th edition of the report. And this is indeed of what trade organizations usually do. Basically, they try and map out the economic activity relevant to the sector. So Eurospace is the association of the European space manufacturing industry, which is the companies and the supply chain which in Europe is producing the space infrastructure, meaning the satellites which are launched, the launchers which are used to launch the satellites, and of course, all the dedicated professional ground segment, which is required to actually make those systems operational. And we do have a very detailed economic model that we use. So basically, we send out questionnaires to the companies, and then they reply, a very complex matrix of information, and then we feed this information into our economic model, and we're able to produce detailed statistics. So this is the reason why we are calling up this press conference today, the release of the annual Facts and Figures report. But we will not talk only about the data from the facts and figures, because I think it's always interesting to put the European space industry manufacturing industry perspective in light of the general context of space activity worldwide. So I will start by presenting to you a few slides which recall the general trends in the space markets globally, so that we can see how Europe weighs in the total of the global space activity. Then I will spend a couple of minutes detailing the situation of the European space budget, because the European institutional customers are major customers for European space systems. And then I will move into presenting the main facts from the annual release of the European Space Industry Facts and Figures Survey. So here I'm just recalling the main facts, but I will skip this chart at this moment because I think it's more interesting to start with the elements of the presentation and to start with the global context. Here I'm just recalling that we have a very specific methodology that we're using. I would like to highlight that we have a strong copyright on our data and charts, meaning that if you receive the report, you're not allowed to copy-paste elements of the reports and use them without letting us know. So we enforce our copyright on the figures, but we are not asking for any payment for free use of our data. The only thing that we require is that you get an authorization to reprint or republish. So if anybody is interested in reprinting and republishing, they need to contact us before, with one major exception, which is the press, of course. If you are a member of the press, you can actually use any element of this publication in your articles without asking for an authorization before. This is normal procedure. Also, everybody involved in the presentation today will receive at the end of the presentation the full slide deck in PDF. So we have all your email addresses. So this will be sent out immediately after the presentation so you can refer to it whenever needed. And this information will also be available on our website. So let's start now with the global context. I will regularly make pauses when we end any given section, so I can open the floor for any brief clarification or question which is required. Also, if you really have a very pressing issues that you would like to raise, you can use the button raise hand, and then I will ask you to actually ask your question and see if we take it immediately or if it is moved later on, because maybe it is addressed in the later steps of the presentation. So this is the very first element which I would like to share with you. So Eurospace maintains a database of all launch activity worldwide, and we are able to categorize all the satellites launched by a number of criteria. One of the main criteria that we use in Eurospace is separating the customers. In space, as you may notice from this chart, for many, many years, most of the activity was relevant to public customers. So on this chart, every histogram here indicates the total mass launched to orbit, so total spacecraft mass, depending on the type of customers. So we have private customers in blue, so private companies which are buying space infrastructure and launching it in space. And then we have public customers such as ESA, NASA, the DoD, the Chinese Space Agency, and so forth. Here we see that in recent years, we have a major innovation which is happening in space markets globally, because while until the early years 2000, most of the activities relevant to space infrastructure deployment was associated exclusively or almost exclusively to public space programs, which represented up to 600 tons launched in a given year. If you look at the years after 2020, you can see that the blue bar is growing very quickly. And in 2022, we have a unique situation which was never seen and witnessed before in the past, where we have the total mass launched on behalf of private customers being higher than the total mass launch on behalf of public customers. I need to highlight that this trend is not what I would qualify as a trend, because basically it is relevant to the activity of one single company. The growth that you can see in the blue bar here from 2019 to 2022 is 100% linked to the activity of Starlink. So Starlink has been deploying an incredible high amount of mass in orbit in recent years, which is displacing the traditional statistics. So in 2022, there were almost 1,000 tons of spacecraft launched in space, of which more than 500 tons were only Starlink satellites. Insist a lot on this. This recent evolution is single-handedly drawn by one single operator, which is Starlink. And Starlink, as you can see, is disrupting space activities in many different ways. And we will see more details later on. So again, two main messages here. The activity in space was mostly driven by public programs in terms of mass launched. And in recent years, the mass deployed by Starlink has outpaced every other space activity in the world and is now more mass launched on behalf of private programs than it was before for public programs. In the Eurospace market model, we have the ability to measure the satellites launched by mass, of course, but we also have a parametric formula which enables us to derive an estimate of the potential market value of any given satellite which is put in orbit. Of course, for many satellites, the market value is known. So whenever it's known, of course, we use the actual value. And here you can see the different impact of the mass launched in space by spacecraft manufacturing region, which is the chart on the left. So here, for instance, you can see that the United States, they deployed more than 650 tons of satellites worth in 2022. The same year, the Chinese industry, blue here, built almost 200 tons worth of satellites that were launched. Actually, it was 164 tons. We see also the position of Europe, which deployed about 50 tons of satellites in orbit, built in Europe, of course, in 2022, and the situation with Russia. So this is the mass evolution. And here, when we look at the production capacity of those industry sectors in China, Europe, India, Japan, Russia, and the USA, we notice three main things. First is indeed the incredible amount of mass deployed in space, which, as you can see from the accolades here, is almost single-handedly derived by the deployments of Starlink. We can see that China, as a space power, is now clearly placed as the second space power in the world because the Chinese space industry is delivering a very big amount of satellites at launch. Again, as I said, more than 160 tons at once. And Europe and the Russians are actually contending for third place in terms of spacecraft production worldwide. And then we can also see that all the other players are very much smaller with respect to those. When we try to translate these mass values in market values, we can move to the chart to the right. And here you see that we have a change in the global appreciation that we can have, which is linked to the fact that the Starlink constellation, despite being very big in terms of mass deployed, actually has a very small market value. Here we have a lot of discussions going around among the people who are looking at those space markets, because the value of Starlink satellites, if you trust the declarations by Elon Musk himself, is about $250,000 per satellite, which makes it a very, very small market value globally. In the Eurospace estimates, we believe that this value is just a marginal cost. So we have a different thesis, and we believe that each Starlink satellite is about $1 million each, 1.5 million, depending whether or not they have inter-satellite links. But the result here is that the volume of activity only translates to very small market values in the total. And so this is also changing a little bit the appreciation we must have of space markets, where basically what we will note is that publicly funded programs generate a lot more value in the infrastructure industry than privately funded programs. And this is an interesting point to note, because when you consider the manufacturing point of view, so the industry that is building the satellites and the launchers to launch them, for them, of course, there is a higher interest from a financial point of view to actually deliver and work for an institutional program than working for a commercial program where the margins would be much, much smaller and the total order intake will be very much limited. So I would like to make a very small pause here in case there is a question before having a look at the general trends in space launch markets. So I don't see any hand raised at this point. So let me move to the next section. So just also to keep you on the general values, the total value for spacecraft production worldwide, in our estimate, is in the order of $60 billion. And we see that the value is very much to be found in the US space programs delivered by the US industry. And then there is the China, and then Europe and Russia are very, very small and leaving behind. These $60 billion of spacecraft market value, of course, do not include the other expenditures from institutional programs, and in particular, all the R&D and study, which are funded by those agencies, but do not necessarily translate into an operational program launched to orbit. So let's have a look at the launch service markets now. And here we see our estimate of the launch service market organized by launcher manufacturing region. So this chart is in $1 billion. And here you see, again, that the global launch market is in 2022 of a total value of around $13 billion. So this is our estimate. It is in line with other analyst estimates. We see that about half of the market is actually captured by the USA, and this is due to two very important points in this data set. One is the SLS launch, which occurred in 2022, which we valued in these statistics at $1.3 billion, so with just one launch. This is the official value that was assessed by the official Office of Inspector General of NASA for the operational cost of the launch. Of course, the SLS program is much more expensive than that, but this is the official value of the launch. And then we have also about 2.5 billion worth of Falcon 9 launchers relevant to the Starlink deployment. Again, there is a lot of discussions on the internet and around about what is the value of a Falcon 9 launch for Starlink. We consider that the value of any Falcon 9 launch is at least the list price. So we value each launch in these statistics at about $62 million, even for Starlink launches. So we see that the USA represents the biggest market point for space launch activity worldwide. The second market point is provided by China. Of course, this assessment would make of the value of the Chinese launch market, which is about $4 billion, is just for comparison purpose, because as you know very well, the Chinese launch market is not open to commercial customers for basically one single reason, is that there is a law that forbids to export any satellite that contains US-built components to China, which means that the Chinese launchers can only launch satellites that are domestically manufactured or that don't contain any US technology on them, which is a very limited number of satellites in the world. So this is why this space market is really very much domestically controlled and domestically operated. The second point that we have here is the market value from Russian launch activity, which is in the order of 1.3 billion in the year. And again, this is a situation, and as you can see from the situation in the past, the launch activity in Russia has been reduced significantly, the one from Russian launchers overall as well, due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the retaliation measures which have been taken, which has limited the access of foreign customers to Russian launchers. So Russian launchers now are very much limited to most domestic demand. Then we have the third point in case here, which is a bit less than 1 billion, which was the value of the launch systems that were deployed in 2022 for operations by ASD-Eurospace. So those are 6 launches overall, if I remember well, 2 Vega and 4 Ariane 5. I will need to verify this, but there was a limited amount of launch activity in Europe, and this translates into a limited market for the launcher building industry. And as you can see, this is a situation where in Europe we see a very decreasing trend, because we could achieve more than 1 billion routinely in the past of turnover associated to launcher manufacturing activities. But in recent years, it has durably dropped below 1 billion. With the last Ariane 5 launch, with the delays we may have for the return to flight of Vega, we may expect that in 2023, this figure may be even a bit smaller than that. Another interesting point to keep in mind is that if you take the total mass launched in space, you take the total value of the space launch market in the same year, and you just make a ratio between the two, we find that the average actual launch price per kilo globally, worldwide, was in the order of $27,000 per kilo to orbit, which is quite an important amount, very, very far away from the often stated values that the access to London, the price of access to space is reducing dramatically. We are not seeing that as a trend. Actually, what we see is that there is a very slight receding price of accessing the orbit, but nothing really significant, which is not yet a game changer for space activity, globally speaking. We can also split the launch market by launcher class, because it's interesting to have a look of what is the activity of launchers worldwide, especially since we have a flurry and emergence of very small launchers in the world. And so it's interesting to be able to look at whether or not these very light and medium launchers, whether they have a market. And basically what we see is that in recent years, the trend has been to more launch associated to heavy launchers. This is basically the trend supported by the development of Falcon 9 launch activities. And we see that the activity and the business associated to very small launchers is actually, as the launchers, very, very, very small. You can see that from the green histograms here, the launch activity associated to very small launch is below 200 million every year. And we do not expect these market opportunities to grow in any significant way. Today, you have a few launcher players in this very light business segment. The leading one is Rocket Lab, of course, which is providing most of the launch opportunities for small payloads with small launchers to LEO. Okay. Here we have a very specific segment of the launch services market, which is the launch demand from what we call the commercial operators. We highlight this specifically because this market has been in the past an important market for Ariane 5. It will also be in the future an important market for Ariane 6. It has been one of the staples for the European launch activity in the past. And so it's interesting to have a look at its evolution. And here we see basically, if you look at the left-hand chart, that in mass, the trend is towards less and less commercial launches to GEO. There has been a structural reduction of demand in recent years. And this has been a subject of concern for Ariane 5 in the past. And it is regaining a little bit in 2022. And indeed, there have been a few more orders of satellites, of geostationary satellite. And we see that potentially the trend may be regaining a little bit. However, we believe that there is a structural reduction of demand for geostationary satellites, which are related to the change of customers for the geostationary satellite services, and in particular, the reduction of demand for broadcast services, which is a very strong trend in recent years. So the total mass launched to GEO in 2022 was about 43 tons, and Falcon 9, the USA, actually captured most of that market, but Europe did quite well with almost 1/3 of the market overall. And here we can see that China is also very much active on this segment and lofting to orbit a lot of geostationary satellite for their own geostationary operators. And we see, of course, that we are very, very far from the maximum value found in 2017, where there were a lot of geostationary launches, and it was almost 133 tons launched to geo in 2017. Okay, annotate. Yes, please, you can annotate. I don't know this request, whether it's working. Vincent, maybe you have a question to ask. I see that you would like to annotate the slide. I don't know how this can work, but okay, so I see some scribbling happening here. Maybe you want to ask a question, Vincent, or you just want to take notes on your side. I don't know if this will reflect to anything you would be able to download. Vincent, can you speak up, please? Because I am not sure I understand what is happening. No, because I will need to move to the next slide at some point. So on the right hand side,
we have a message from Vincent saying sorry, sorry, wrong manipulation.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so let me have a look at the right hand side. So on the right hand side, we translate the value in tons, in value in $1 billion. So we value every launch service, and we come to the conclusion that the specific segment of launches to geo in 2022 had a market value below 1 billion. If you put this in perspective with the previous slide, where you could actually, now I cannot move slides anymore. So I don't know what Vincent has done, but now I have this little pen and I cannot move anything anymore, which is definitely not helping me to actually manage the presentation. Okay, so I'm sorry for this, but nothing is working anymore in PowerPoint.
Pierre, you have
Yes?
there is a small logo on your right hand side. So you have the ask to annotate and then ask to control. You should put to ask to control again.
Yes, but I need to get off the full screen before, I guess. And so let me look at this. I don't see where this logo could be. So let me share again. Maybe that will be enough getting in and out of the share. Okay, share. Let's see. Now it's back to normal. Okay. So yes, I wanted to put the value of the geo market in perspective of the total value of the market, which was 13 billion in 2022. So the launch to geo is just today a small fraction of the total launch activity, globally speaking. And we have measured that there has been a price reduction of the launch service to geo. Today, we think that the average price per kilo to go to the geostationary orbit is about 19,000 kilogram. And this has been slightly receding in recent years. And an interesting point is noting that there doesn't seem to be a lot of price elasticity for launcher demand, because indeed, even with launch prices going slightly down, we don't see any major acceleration of demand. And I believe that this is normal because the launch demand is only marginally associated to the launch price, because the launch demand is driven by the demand for satellites. So you buy a satellite and then you look for a launch. You don't decide to launch because the price of launch is low. The price of launch is actually what enables you to select your launcher provider based on competitive tendering. So the elasticity of launch demand from an economist perspective is not directly linked to the price of launch, but more to the demand for satellites and the price of satellites, which are probably the main driver for launcher demand, which is something that is sometimes not presented that way. There is a lot of talk about what would happen if you could drive significantly down the cost of access to space. And my take on this is that this will not really change the launch demand in any significant way if you don't drive down the same way the cost of satellites. So this is an important point to be taken. So again, I would like to make a little pause before moving to the next section in case we have any pressing question arising. There doesn't seem to be any, so let me move to the next slide. So one very peculiar situation when you look at space market is what we call the preeminence of captive demand. Basically, we know that in space markets, most of the customers come from the same region as the manufacturers. Or to put it the other way around, the customers for space systems, they like to buy from their domestic industry. And actually, this is embedded in a number of very well-known regulations. In the USA, you cannot provide satellites and launch services to NASA if you're not a registered US company working with US personnel or people with a green card. Similarly, the DoD has very stringent procurement requirements where basically you have most of your suppliers which have to be registered US companies. In Europe, of course, we have more or less the same rule where most of the ESA programs must be from European suppliers. This is also applying to the European Union programs and of course to a lot of national programs in Europe. So we have a situation where the domestic institutional market is usually associated to limited competition at international level because most of the demand and the supply is actually domestic. So this is what we highlight on those two charts here, where we see the global spacecraft production by region, highlighting the difference between how much of the demand is associated to the domestic and institutional programs for the launcher sector, the space sector there, and how much of the demand is associated to commercial and export business. And here we see the peculiarity of Europe and the USA, which today are the only two regions where a large portion of spacecraft production and launch services associated to that is driven by commercial or export programs. In all other regions, the number one output of the space industry is associated to the domestic institutional demand, which is, again, I insist, associated to very limited, when at all, any competition in the international level. So here we have the dependency of Europe and the USA today from commercial programs, which is very high. Also, we took the initiative of presenting the Starlink impact in those charts because, again, as you can note, in the USA, the now Starlink represents, measured in tons, most of the output produced by the industry in the 5 past years, which is really a very significant amount. And we see the peculiarity of Europe where, and this is a situation that is stable for the past 20 years, where most of the output measured in tons of the European industry is associated to commercial and export markets, and the domestic and institutional output is associated to very lower values in terms of mass at launch. So this reflects in the global spacecraft production on the left and also translates into the launch activity on the right, because as you may note, launch activity is also very often domestically procured exclusively, at least whenever it is possible to do so. And as you know, in Europe now that we have a gap in the European supply chain for launchers, we will have to use non-European launchers for a few European programs next year, and this year already with Euclid, for instance, that will be launched by Falcon 9 and so on. But other than that, we see that main space power have a very consistent policy of sourcing domestically all the infrastructure and launch service they require. When we compare institutional programs globally, we can see that today we have a major trend which is impacting a lot the data set, which is the growing ambition of China. the Chinese institutional space program has been really accelerating in the past years. Today, China is a complete space power. They have a global, well, not 100% global, but they have a domestic navigation and positioning system. They have domestic capabilities for tactical and military observation. They have domestic capabilities for a space station in orbit, in low Earth orbit. They are landing. They have landed on Mars. Clearly, the Chinese Space Agency is really moving ahead very, very fast. They have more than 9 series of operational launchers. They're able to launch with small, medium, and very big launchers. They are considering now also reusable launchers. They also have a budding commercial launch industry, which is developing, which actually recently performed the very first Metalox launch to orbit. So clearly, China is the new space power to reckon with. And what is interesting to note is that this acceleration really took place in this decade. Before 2012, 2013, China was still considered, rightfully so, a second-rate player in space. This is not the case anymore. The institutional space program of China is more important, all things comparable, than the institutional space program of the USA, considering both the civil and military component. So clearly, this is the main message we have here. China is launching a lot. It's launching more and more, and it is today surpassing every institutional space program in the world. Again, I cannot insist more than that, because you will also be exposed to other figures where you will they will provide assessments of the Chinese space budget, for instance. And the recently published Euroconsult report on that, they say that the Chinese space budget is $8 billion. And then, you know, they put it in perspective with the US space budget, which is about $50 billion. And then, of course, you would be led to believe that China is a second-rate player compared to the USA. This is not the case. The Chinese space budget information is not a public information anywhere. So when you make this kind of extrapolation on the value of the budget, you should be very, very careful to ask yourself whether or not it reflects that much space activity that we can measure looking at every single launch which has been performed by the Chinese Space Agency. In contrast, we highlighted the Europe trend. We see that the European deliveries to orbit measured in mass are very much on a receding trend. And this is a little bit worrisome. It means that the volume of activity which is associated to the European space programs is not growing. Again, the mass indicator is not a very, very good one for everything, particularly if you think about the fact that Europe doesn't pursue a human rated program, which usually has a very strong impact on the total mass launched. But again, it's very important to highlight those two very different trends from China, which is really on an exponential growth path, and Europe, which is very much on a slightly receding linear thread. Of course, the USA remain, from the institutional program point of view, the second player worldwide, again with a very complete program with a lot of military activities, but also human programs towards the International Space Station in Leo, and in 2022, the massive achievement of the Artemis launch. So that was really, really something. And Russia is today a player which is slightly on the receding side. Everybody knows that there is a problem in Russia to fund the space programs, but there is still an important layer of activity which is driven by the strategic component and the military satellite deployment, which remain a strong asset for the Russian space industry. And indeed, when we talk about military satellites, we are pleased to share with you here the analysis we make decade over decade. So on the left, you have the total mass launched in space on behalf of military program between 2003 and 2012 by by customer regions, so China, Europe, Japan, Russia, the USA. And on the right, you see what has happened in the last decade, 2013 and 2022. And here we would like to share two main messages with you. The very first is that the militarization of space is indeed growing. There is more mass launched in space in the last decade than the previous one. We also know that China is really catching up. And if you look at the military space programs in the previous decade, 2003, 2012, which represented an accumulated mass of less than 150 tons, with more than 300 tons in the last decade, they are really matching one-on-one the effort that was deployed by the USA. You also can see the focus of intention and activity by looking at the colors in the histogram, and you see that in military programs, the main focus remain observation, remote sensing at large, which includes optical, radar, and signal intelligence. And this is really a capacity which is deployed consistently in China, the USA, but also in Russia. If you look at the situation in Europe, well, clearly Europe is not playing that game. We know that the major force in Europe for European space programs is the European Space Agency, which is a gathering of civil interests exclusively. And in Europe, military programs are only pursued basically with a national focus. So we see that France has a military space programs, Germany has one, the UK has one, Italy and Spain, but all together they're not able to join forces to create a major force and a big budget impact to actually have a significant presence on the space military or defense arena. And this again tells us something which is very clear. All this mass which is put in orbit really creates a strategic gap between us and the other space powers. Basically, from our point of view, the main core difference between the three main space powers, which are China, Russia, and the USA, and Europe, is the military component. If you remove the military component, clearly the gap is not that big between us and the other three big space powers. So again, militarization of space is growing. This is clearly a trend, and China is catching up. Again, this is a very important message to keep. Here we have just more detail focusing on annual launches of military satellites with the three main space powers, just to highlight how much China has invested in the past 2 years in terms of deploying strategic and tactical capacity in orbit, which again is incredibly impressive. We like also to put a little focus on the specific segment of commercial satellites. Commercial satellites, we have a very clear definition at Eurospace. We say a satellite is commercial when the customer is a private entity. So for instance, in our analysis here, every satellite which has been built for spacecraft operators such as Arabsat, Yahsat, and Nilesat, which are publicly owned companies, are not falling in this category. Here we see that the business driven by commercial operators is really not very, very big. Globally speaking, the total commercial spacecraft market is less than 9 billion in 2022, which is about 1/5 of our assessment of the global spacecraft market. So commercial systems, they represent only 1/5 of the total market for spacecraft systems, meaning that all the rest, all the other value is actually driven by institutional programs. And this is very contrasted with the analysis that we presented at the beginning, if you remember, where we could see that private initiative satellites represented 600 tons at launch in 2022, while institutional programs only represented about 400 tons launched. And here again, we have this new paradigm, which is developed around the Starlink system, where we have a lot of mass produced and launched, but a stated value, which is very, very small. So we can see here in these charts that for the USA, the total commercial business for spacecraft was in the order of $5 billion in the year, of which Starlink represented probably half. And the other half was associated mostly to geostationary commercial programs and to a lesser amount with Earth observation, private Earth observation programs and the likes. We see that Europe remains year after year the #2 player on the commercial spacecraft market. Again, this is something which has been a staple in the past. It is still happening today. The European industry is super competitive on commercial tenders for satellites, and it's competing effectively against the USA. And indeed, if you remove the value of the Starlink business, which is not open to competition because it is a fully integrated supply chain within SpaceX, you can see that in 2022, Europe eventually captured more business on the commercial market than the US industry, which is a very, very satisfying point for us. And we see that this has been happening already in 2017. So clearly, the European industry can be competitive on commercial markets. What you see also is that China, Japan, and Russia are not very present on this specific segment of the spacecraft market demand. And this, again, is related to the specifics of those countries where most of the business is associated to national programs, and they don't have easy access to the commercial segment of the demand for spacecraft systems.
Question from Paul Kune. How confident are you on your figures for Russia from America?
Well, we have, so the total mass is very well known, and we are very aware with the fact that there is only very limited commercial and export potential for Russian systems. So clearly here on this commercial spacecraft market, I'm pretty confident that the value for Russia is almost nil. But maybe, Paul, you have a specific thing that you would like to raise?
No, it was just by curiosity. So how did you assess the Russian market in this year? So that was, and how confident you are? Are they?
Well, on Russia, we are very strong in confidence because, again, the Russians are not producing commercial satellites in any significant way. For instance, the commercial operators in Russia, they usually bought from Europe. So you see RSCC and the Gazprom, which were procuring most of the commercial satellites from a Russian perspective, they were buying them from Europe more than anything else. So yes, for Russia, we're pretty confident with this. Again, the economic formula that we're using to create market values for satellites is always associated to a number of theses and assumptions. But when you look at the total mass and you look at the customer at the end, you can see that basically Russian satellites almost never have private customers, but are always built for institutional programs. So this is where the level of confidence becomes very high, specifically for Russia when we look at the commercial market. So I would like now to move, but maybe there is another question before we move to the next section. I would like to present 2 slides about the situation of the European space budget, which is a very important point of revenue for the European industry. But maybe there is another question before I move to this. Apparently not. So in Europe, in the Eurospace, we do monitor as much as we can the situation of the European space budget because it is the #1 revenue opportunity for European space manufacturing companies. So basically, we noted that we can measure the European space budget by looking at the source. So where is the money coming from? But also looking at how the money is spent. So basically, we separate the analysis by source, and I will detail that, but also by implementing entity. But in the end, it's always the same money, so the amounts are the same. So if you look at the source of funds, basically, there are 2 main ways to attract money to the institutional space programs in Europe. One is to have a national space budget, and this is the main source for funding for institutional space programs in Europe. The national space budget basically is a decision at national level in France, the UK, Italy, Spain, Lithuania, and everywhere to allocate a portion of the government budget to space programs. Then this portion is allocated to the ESA programs or to national programs in the civil and military domain, but it is money whose initial decision is to be allocated to space programs. National space budgets, money which is originally flagged by every nation towards space activities, in our assessment was 8.3 billion in 2022. On the other hand, the European Union levies revenues from the member states, but those revenues are not flagged for any specific application. The revenue that are levied by the Union actually come up from the VAT percentage, and then they're also calculated based on the GDP, and then you have, a number of bilateral agreements to change the share. But globally speaking, the budget which is driven from the member states to the Union is neutralized. It is then the European Union, together with the various instances, so the Parliament, the Commission, and the Council, which decides how to allocate the budget to given activities, including the agriculture policy and including the main program for space activities, which are driven by the Union, basically Galileo and Copernicus, which attract most of the budget, but also the Horizon Europe program for space, and other smaller activities in SSA, SST, and in next year there will be IRIS Square. So this is a very different thing, because basically it's money which is not flagged for space that's coming into the Union, but the Union decides to allocate it to space programs. In our assessment, the budget available for spending on behalf of the European Union programs for space activities was 2.4 billion euro in 2022. So here we see basically 78% of the money is decided and driven by member states, so it's a national decision, and 22% of the budget is driven by the European Union, so I would call that a European level decision. This money is channeled with a variety of complex delegation agreements towards the European Space Agency, but also it can be managed by national entities for military and civil programs. So if you look at the right-hand side, you see that this total of 10.7 billion euro, which is available for spending in space programs, institutional space programs in Europe, basically is managed by ESA for the most of it. 2/3 of the amount, 6.5 billion in the year, are actually entrusted to ESA for spending. And this includes almost all of the European Union space budgets, the Galileo and Copernicus parts, and also all the money which is entrusted to ESA by the member states for the mandatory and optional programs, which do cover a large array of activities, which I'm not going to detail today. So again, 2/3 of that is managed by ESA, which makes the European Space Agency the main procurement force in Europe for institutional space programs. And then we can see that the second point of spending is actually the programs which are managed by national entities at national level. Here we have basically two main players in Europe, which are the France and Germany, which represent a lot of investment in national programs. But also in recent years, we see that Italy is also stepping up its investment in national programs, civil and military. So the civil programs managed at national level represent about 2 billion euro in 2022. And the military program managed at national level, they represented about 1.3 billion euro. It is interesting to note that EUMETSAT itself only manages a small portion of its budget. The budget of EUMETSAT, if I remember well, is in the order of 550 to 600 million, but a part of that is delegated to ESA for implementation and the production of the operational space infrastructure of EUMETSAT. So the totality of the EUMETSAT budget is not directly managed by EUMETSAT, but is entrusted to ESA, the same way as the Union is entrusting ESA for the procurement and development of their Copernicus and Galileo system. So clearly we see here the structuring role that the European Space Agency is playing in the European institutional space programs landscape, together with the national programs, civil and military. And we see that clearly the European Union, which is a major funding force in the total, is actually stepping a little bit back in terms of procuring and the program management activities. We can have a look now at the evolution of funds by source in recent years, and you can see here that the member states' investment, the national space budgets, have been growing quite significantly since 2013 all the way to 2020. There has been a little reduction in 2021, but now it's again stepping up in 2022. So this is clearly the #1 funding source for institutional space programs in Europe, which is more than 8 billion euro since 2020. And then we can see also the impact of the European Union space budgets with the impression of growth in recent years. So I would like to make a very small technical point here. We measure the value of the EU space budget with the amount which is available for spending to ESA in any given year. If you look at the annual activity report produced by the European Commission, you will see much lower figures when you look at the amounts that the Commission is entrusting to ESA every single year. This is because there is a problem with the budget execution of the ESA budget, which is affecting the European Union programs in a quite significant way, meaning that the amount that was not spent in the previous year is available in the budget of the next year, sometimes creating the impression of budget growth, even if it is only a transfer of amounts which were not spent. So this is a specific situation that is actually maybe an accounting rule, but again, we need to be specific here. So the yellow histogram is also associated to a share unknown to us of unspent budget every year. So I would like to open the floor again for questions before moving to the last part of the presentation, which is the figures of the annual facts and figures report. All good. So after this introduction on the context, I am presenting here the figures which are prepared every year thanks to the annual facts and figures survey. So the survey is sent out to all companies in Europe, and then we get their replies in the questionnaires, and we have them compiled into an economic model, which enables us to crunch the data and produce the figures which I will be sharing with you this year. So the main facts this year are business. The final sales of the industry are now 8.2 billion in 2022. So this is a reduction by 400 million euro compared to 2021. I will explain later on what are the dynamics of the decrease. On the other hand, we measure employment growth very significantly, because we reach in 2022 the value of 57,000 full-time employees in the space manufacturing sector, where we had 52,000 last year. So 5,000 more in a single year. This is a huge point of growth. So it's interesting because it shows that there is a dynamic in the industry. When the employment is growing, it is a clear indicator that the expectations for market development are good, globally speaking, in the sector. But we will see that there is also one specific trend underlining this, which needs to be analyzed separately from the rest. You can see that the evolution of employment follows more or less the evolution of final sales. You can see also that final sales exhibit a kind of cyclic component, which is well known in space and is associated to the demand for geostationary satellites, for which, as I presented before, the European industry is very exposed to. So basically, we are good players on this market segment, but since it has a cyclical component, of course, this business cycles also affects very clearly the revenue of the industry. Other than that, we also note an important growth of business starting in 2003, 2004, and all the way to 2019, okay? And here, clearly, this is the general trend, the growth trend from institutional programs. We saw also that the investment of member states in Europe was growing. So this is clearly supporting a good business trend with the industry. And we have also here in 2020 a major drop. So this was a technical reduction of activity associated to the COVID crisis, which we presented at length in the facts and figures presentation 2 years ago. I'm not going to give more details on that now, but we see that as soon as 2021, the level of sales actually regained the one from the previous years. But we note that there was no compensation of the drop in 2020, which is something that we expected but did not happen. Let's have a focus now on the employment trends by company type. So the European space industry is highly concentrated within a few players. Actually, 4 big industrial groups concentrate 60% of the total space employment in Europe. Those 4 groups are the groups Airbus, Thales, Safran, and Leonardo, which have actually either space business units like Airbus. Airbus Defence and Space is managing the space activities of Airbus, or they have specifically made joint ventures or subsidiaries to perform space activities, such as Ariane Group, which is a joint venture between Airbus and Thales, Thales Alenia Space, which is a major player in European space, which is a joint venture between Thales and Leonardo, and so forth. So those 4 groups today, they represent 60% and more of the total space employment in the manufacturing industry. And we see that they exhibit, in terms of employment, a growth trend in the past 10 years. Actually, a bit more on the chart here. You have 2009 to 2022, so we have technically 13 years. But we see that the business growth, which we have noticed before, was actually accompanied by an employment growth trend, which stalled in the COVID period, but is now again in full effect. We also know that the space industry is also taking advantage of the capabilities offered by other large groups. For instance, Air Liquide is a very big group at the global level, but of course it has a share of space activity which is not as significant as the one we could see in Airbus or Thales. But still, the other large groups, they represent up to 4,000 and so employees in 2022, and they have been also growing slightly in the past decade, although in a growth which was much slower than the one we have seen in the major groups. They represent today between 7 and 8% of total employment in the industry. Another important segment for the industrial landscape for space in Europe is what we call the mid-caps. So there is no official definition of a mid-cap, of course, regretfully, but mid-caps, in our definition, they are companies which have less than 10,000 total employees at global scale, not limited to space activities. And well-known mid-caps in space are OHB or GMV or SAPCA. Okay, so those mid-caps have exhibited a very significant growth trend in the past decade. They almost doubled their employment. They have been a very vivid growth point, and today they represent almost 15,000 employees in the total landscape out of 57,000. So they are today main players and well-established players in the European landscape. And then we have SMEs. There's also here a point which we call the new space, which would be more rightfully called the startups, by the way. But let's talk about the key points here. So we have small entities. Most of them are what we call legacy SMEs. So basically, there are SMEs which are involved in the space segment, most of the time as equipment suppliers to the other players in the sector, but also sometimes are small companies which are producing complete satellite systems, but of a lesser scale, such as GomSpace or EasySpace or NanoAvionics that are there. So those SMEs, they represent today between 6 and 7% of total employment in the sector. Again, their employment has been growing on a par with the others, and they are well-established players, although there's a lot of them, but they're very small companies. We in Eurospace, we have a list of about 400 space SMEs in Europe. And then we see a new emerging trend for space players in Europe, which I labeled here new space. Basically, those are startup companies creating in recent years and which have been developing very, very, very fast in the past 3 to 4 years, to the point that we decided to identify them separately. Before they were counted as SMEs without any specific difference, but now we identify them separately. And what is very specific with this segment is that today it represents more than 5,000 employees, which is almost 10% of the total space employment But the peculiarity of those companies is that for the vast majority of them, they still don't have a product. So they have very limited revenues, when any revenue at all. And all those employees, they are funded by the equity rather than by the business. And the consequence of this is that there has been a very strong tension on employment markets in the European space industry in the recent years, because those companies have been competing for workers with the others. As you could see, all the other segments have been growing their employment, meaning that everybody was hiring. And this hiring spree actually created the impression of a shortage of personnel and skills in the sector, because everybody was fighting for the same experienced engineers and technicians. Also, it has created the tension on salaries. So basically today, it is more expensive to hire people in the space industry than it was before. As an analyst and observer of the markets, my concern is on a different point. My concern is that when 10% of the employment in the sector is not supported by a sufficient market to pay the salaries, I am worried that in the future, these people will find themselves in a difficult situation. So how long can equity fund employment in the new space startup environment for the space industry in Europe? Honestly, I don't know. But I think that if there was to be sufficient business to actually pay for all those workers on a recurrent basis, we would have not 8.2 billion total final sales for the European space industry, but we would need to have about 10 billion market, accessible market for the industry, in order to make this new emerging sector stable and viable in the long term. So again, it's very interesting to see new players emerging, but we would be concerned with the fact that these employees, these employment, those companies may not all be viable in the long term. And so this is a point of concern on my side. So here we have the split of personnel presented a bit differently. You can still see the four categories of companies here, the large four, the other large groups, etc. But what is interesting to see here is also the distribution by country. And we see that France, with 20,000 employees, represent more than 40% of the total employment in Europe and is the main driving force. And we see that in France, the employment is very highly concentrated in the large four groups, which is not the case in Germany, which is the second player in Europe, with more than 10,000 employees today, and where we see a more balanced situation, where basically you have almost as many employees in the large four groups than you have in the mid caps. Okay, you can look at the startup environment in France and in Germany. It's about the same level at this point. The third player in space is Italy, which has been really growing in recent years. And we see that in Italy, the presence of the large four group is quite significant, about 60%. But the mid caps, and particularly the big mid cap in Italy is Avio, the group Avio, are really important players there. We see that the startup environment in Italy is not as developed as it is elsewhere. Then we have the UK, which is in a very peculiar situation because most of the new space startups in Europe are to be found in the UK, which has created a very hospitable environment for those startups. Also, the UK has more facilities for attracting capital because they have better links with the USA. So this explains why in the UK, most of the growth in employment was actually driven by those startups. Actually, in the UK, it's one of the only countries in Europe where we have seen the other industry declining in employment. So we have more growth in the startup domain, and we have declining employment in the other segments. And then to finish up, we'd like to say a few words about Spain. Spain is the only country, major player in Europe, where we have an overwhelming representation of mid-caps, which are the #1 employment point with companies such as GMV or Sener. And clearly, Spain is a specific situation where the mid-caps, the real mid-caps, are playing a very, very big role. But also we have good presence from the large four, because as you can see from the chart here, the large four are really organized to be present almost everywhere where there is a sizable space budget to be captured in Europe. This is because those companies have grown both vertically by integrating and acquiring their suppliers, but also sometimes horizontally by acquiring competitors. So this has been the growth. And then we have this pie chart on the right-hand side, which is a homage to our members, basically. So every Eurospace member, which is more than 1,000 employees in 2022, is given his own specific share. So you can see that Airbus alone provides 20% of the total space employment in the European industry. Thales Alenia Space, 14, which makes it the second player. Then we have Ariane Group with 8%, which is the third. Then we have OHB, which, by the way, is a mid-cap by our definition, which represents 5% of total employees. Telespazio, 4%, Avio, Beyond Gravity, GMV, and Safran, 2% each. So those are the real well-established big players in Europe. All of them are Eurospace members, so we welcome them, we thank them for their support, and we are very happy to see them growing significantly. And all the other companies in the sector, they represent 41% of the European space industry employment, which is really impressive. So let's have a look now at the evolution of the business. So in Eurospace, we have a series which date back to 1991. So they are in current economic conditions, very difficult to create a constant euro for space programs, globally speaking. So we don't attempt to that. But when we look at the evolution in current economic conditions, and we split the business in two main segments. Basically, we have the revenues associated with the institutional programs in Europe in blue. And then we have the business associated to commercial and export programs in red. And here we see the evolution over almost 30 years, more than 30 years, where we had a period in the past where basically we have seen the rise of commercial programs all the way to the magic year of 2000 and 2001, where the revenue associated to commercial programs was even higher than the revenue associated to European institutional programs. At the beginning of the year 2000, the trend was reversed, and this was driven by two main factors. First was the cyclical reduction of the geostationary demand, which really drove down the red curve all the way to the throw of 2003. At the same time, there was a rolling out of new programs from the European Union, such as Copernicus and Galileo, which created more business opportunity and which had driven the blue curve in a growth trend that actually peaked all the way in 2019. So today we have about 5,500 million euro of revenues, which is associated to the European institutional programs, and we have almost 3 billion, which have been associated to commercial and export programs. What we see is that since 5 years now, the commercial and export market is globally receding. Again, as I said, there is a structural component there. Most of the activities associated to commercial and export programs are driven by the geostationary demand, so those large geo satellites for which European industry has been very competitive in the past. But this also supported good activity for Arianespace, because as you know, Arianespace has been a #1 player on the geo-commercial satellite launch segment. And clearly, when this segment is declining, as it has been the case in recent years, of course, the European industry revenues are actually showing the same level of decline. Again, as I said, this is structural, so it is taking up a little bit. There have been good orders signed for geostationary satellite in 2023, but globally speaking, those satellites are a bit smaller, they're a bit less. So we don't expect, regretfully, this element to be reaching out towards more growth in the coming years. It may retake a little bit in 23 and 24, but we don't expect it to be a major segment of growth for the industry in recent years. If we look at the evolution of turnover by a big product segment, we can actually identify 5 main segments for the production of European space systems. One is what we call the satellite application segment. So this is the area where we bundle together all the operational telecommunications, observation, and navigation systems for private and institutional customers alike. And as you can see, with almost 5 billion euro of revenue in 2022, this is the #1 area of activity for the European space industry, but it's also the case for other players worldwide. Clearly, satellite applications are the reason why we do space. The second point of business in 2022 is associated to what we call scientific systems. So this is a category where we bundle scientific programs, such as a Euclid, for instance, or a Gaia that was launched in the past, but also activities related to human activity in space. So the ATV system, for instance, in the past was bundled there as well. And then we bundle there everything we do in relation to planetary exploration. And those scientific system activity are mostly associated up to 95% to the European Space Agency programs. And this has been one of the positive and optimism area in the past 5 years, because it has been a point of growth. And we do expect, looking at the commitments made at the latest ESA ministerial, that this specific segment will still be growing a little bit in coming years, contrary to the satellite applications area, where basically we saw the receding trend in recent years, which is due to the commercial market reduction. The third revenue point is associated to launcher systems, production and development, which represented about 1.2 billion in 2022. And this has been receding in recent years. There has been a surge in activity in 2014, 2015, mostly related to the acceleration of development activities in the ESA frame for Ariane 6 development and Vega C development. On the other hand, we have seen those activities affected by technical delays, which also eventually reduce the payments associated to the milestones. So the receding trend in launcher activity is associated to less money made available from the European Space Agency development programs, but also to the reduction of activity, launch activity in Kourou, which has been affected by the COVID in 2020, and also for technical difficulties and delays that we have witnessed in the recent years. And so we do expect that 2023, from that point of view, will not create any major new opportunity for launchers. And we will see when Ariane 6 begins operations, whether or not it manages to find a good market and provides a relay for growth. The third point we have in this segment chart is associated to what we call support activities. This included the manufacturing and operations of ground segments, but also a lot of engineering services and so on, which are provided by the sector to institutional and private customers alike. And this has been an important segment of growth. I would like to highlight that there is a statistical bias here. Since we introduced this category in 2009, we are highlighting better and better the players in this category. But still we see that the ground segment is growing because we have a trend for more satellites being launched in orbit, which create a specific demand for professional ground segments. And today it represents about 1 billion euro in the industry revenue. And then, of course, we have other and unknown, which we cannot classify, which is the usual problem when we do statistical series. Let's put a little focus here on the European institutional market, because again, as I said, it represents today almost 60% of industry revenue. So it is an important revenue point, and it's interesting to look how it is split between the different revenue sources. So the European Space Agency programs, and in this chart, we exclude the programs managed by the European Space Agency on behalf of the Union or on behalf of EUMETSAT. Okay? So those are taken away. So this is really, these are mandatory and optional programs. They represent almost 3 billion euro in revenue in the industry. This is a very sizable amount, and ESA, as we said, is the #1 customer for the industry. The second point of revenue here is the total of national programs, which represented in 2022 almost 1 billion in revenue for the industry at European level, slightly receding compared to 2021 and 2020, but still a sizable amount, 1 billion, okay? Then we have the revenues associated to the European Union program. So our estimate is that they represented about 800 million of revenues within the space industry in Europe, which again has been really a major growth if you consider the early years, 2009, 2010, those European Union programs were really very, very small. Today, they represent major opportunities for the industry. And we do expect those opportunities to remain because Copernicus has all the follow-ons which are required. Galileo, the second generation, is coming up. And with IRIS², there will probably be even more revenue opportunities coming from the Union in the future. So this is a point of positive projections for us. I see that there is one element which is missing from the chart. So let me make it appear, because it's a problem of the size of the box here, because we were missing the green part, which is associated to the national military programs. And here we really see, again, an important trend towards growth. There is a stronger and stronger interest for military programs at national levels in Europe. We believe that the recent approval of the French Loi de Programmation Militaire confirms that there is a strong interest in France. We see that confirming also interest for military programs. And so those today represent the third segment from the institutional program perspective for the European industry, with more than 600 million in the year. And again, we do expect this to grow in the coming years. And then we have the EUMETSAT programs. This is only the part which is associated to building the spacecraft infrastructure for EUMETSAT, because EUMETSAT has also a lot of other spending for the ground segment and et cetera, but this is the part. So EUMETSAT programs, which are actually gracing the cover of the Eurospace Facts and Figures report this year, they represent a stable, not significant, but a stable amount of revenue for the space industry in the past. And again, EUMETSAT is a recurring operational program-focused agency. And so those program opportunities, they remain for the industry in the long term. So this is a very good point. Here we have the pendant of the previous slide. Basically, we are looking at the commercial, satellite, and ground systems market segments. So we are looking at everything which is either an export, either a commercial program from private customers. And here we see basically three different segments of activity. We have the sales of complete commercial satellite systems to European customers, such as Inmarsat, Eutelsat, SES, Northspace, and the likes. We have in red the sales of complete satellite systems to exports. So we are selling them to Arabsat, Nilesat, Yahsat, and the likes. So we have a lot of commercial satellite operators outside Europe, which are favoring European systems for their activities. And then we have a specific segment in gray, which represents the equipment. So we sell payloads, we sell propulsion systems, we sell tanks, which are then integrated to systems which are not manufactured in Europe. So this is the sale of equipments and parts to the rest of the world. So basically, all the experts are the sum of the red and the gray. And then everything which is European commercial segment is the blue. And here we see that for both the complete satellite systems for European customers, so the blue bars, and the sales of complete satellite system to the rest of the world, the red bar, clearly here the trend in the medium term is towards decreasing. And I said it at the beginning, this is the current situation with the geostationary satellite segment of demand, where structurally speaking, they are ordering less. And again, there are many reasons. that can be discussed later on, but this is a structural trend which is really affecting the European industry in a very significant way because it represented historically one of its main market segments and outputs. On the other hand, we see that the exports of European equipment and parts is actually growing in recent years. It is almost 600 million in 2022. It was 550 million in 2021. It was again almost 600 in 2020. This is a very good point for the European industry. It is an area that enables also equipment suppliers to access to an export market, which is not common. And globally speaking, I will present later down in the presentation, this creates opportunities for positive impact for the European trade balance, which is a very good point for the European space system sales globally, that they contribute positively to the European trade balance. So globally speaking, this commercial satellite and ground segments market is in the order of 1.3, 1.4 billion in recent years. Again, it has been receding a lot. In the big years, it was reaching to a value that was exceeding 2 billion. So this is clearly a point of concern, the situation of commercial satellite operators, which are reducing their demand in recent years. And here we look at the last business segment that we have, which is basically the launcher segment market. Again, I would like to clarify one point, which is sometimes misunderstood. At Eurospace level, we measure the revenue which are made by the industry which is producing the launcher. We are not measuring the value of the launch services provided by Arianespace and ELV. So clearly here, we're looking at the revenue associated to producing the launchers, which are then operated by Arianespace. Okay. On the other hand, we believe it is interesting to look at the market structure of the Arianespace operations. So basically on the left-hand side, what you see is the situation of the revenues associated to the activities of building. And I think that we have one histogram missing in 2022 here. The red one has gone missing. So we will update this chart before circulating it. But because there were some revenues from operational systems in there. So we have had a few bugs here. So on the left-hand side, we see the revenue associated to building the launchers for launch and associated to development activities in Europe, basically those Ariane 6 and Vega development programs managed by the European Space Agency. And we see, if we look at this slide, which is basically, again, the revenue of the launcher industry in Europe, we see that there was always a balanced approach between development revenues and the sale of operational systems. And the more Arianespace is selling services, the more the industry is creating revenue opportunities from its launcher manufacturing business. Okay? On the right-hand side, on the other hand, we see the evolution of the Arianespace market or activities associated to the use of European launchers. So basically, it's the total mass launched by Arianespace using either Ariane, either Vega, because as you know, Arianespace in the past has also been launching the Soyuz, but the Soyuz launcher was not associated to revenues in the European industry, okay? And here we see that the structure of the Ariane and Vega demand is very much associated mostly to non-European institutional customers. So we have here indeed a situation where the European launcher industry somehow is also very much driven by the commercial and export markets, because only a small fraction of the Arianespace business is actually giving opportunities for ordering more launchers, launch vehicles from the industry. So this is a very peculiar situation. Again, if you looked at the situation for the ULA was basically only mostly launching for the national program of the USA. In Europe, we have this situation where our launcher operator must find competitive opportunities to sell to commercial customers. Otherwise, it is not able to close its business case. And this translates into the European industry revenues. So from the top of my mind, the revenue associated to launch and manufacturing and development activities was in the order of 890 million euro in total, half of which was associated to development programs. So it is the blue histogram that we see here. And the other half was associated to the sale of operational services. And it's the red histogram, which has disappeared for reasons I don't know, but it will be corrected before we circulate the PDF. So here is the situation with the European launcher segment. The main point for us, which is a critical point of concern, is that this is a segment which have seen receding sales year after year for more than 5 years in a row. And this is also reflected by the receding market opportunities associated to Arianespace operations. So basically, I wouldn't say that we have a major crisis here, but if we put together reduced business, the technical issues that we have in the Ariane 6 development, which is delaying the introduction of Ariane 6, if we consider also the untimely failure of the Vega launch, if we consider that we have not yet a date for the return of Vega to flight operations, and the fact that the last Ariane 5 has been launched a couple of days ago, clearly we have a situation where the launcher manufacturing industry in Europe will be seeing and looking at the future with some rightful level of concern that we share with them, of course. So clearly here, we need to address the short and medium-term future for this segment and whether or not it will be managing to recoup and regain good market shares and find some profitable business in the medium term. And one of the last slides which I want to share with you today is a main economic information that we have derived in the past and that we are happy to share with you every year. We analyze the satellite trade balance over a decade. The reason why we do this over a decade is because you have a lot of erratic variations in launcher activities or in spacecraft activities over a year. So focusing only on one year doesn't seem to be very representative. But when you bundle together 10 years of activity, we find that we have, globally speaking, at European level, very positive satellite trade balance, meaning that we export more value in satellite than we import the same value in satellite. The trade balance that we have, the trade surplus that we have on spacecraft activity, satellite activity, is in average $530 million in 10 years. This is less than the trade balance that the United States has, because United States manages to export even more satellites than Europe and to import a little bit less. So the trade surplus that satellite business is giving to the United States is $850 million a year. The concerning point is that most of the satellite exports of the USA are actually coming to Europe. If you look at the red bar here, well, 100% of that is US satellites. So basically, Europe is buying a lot of US satellites. It is also exporting a lot of European satellites. But if it did buy less American satellites and would buy European satellites instead, not only the trade surplus would be better, but there would also be more opportunities for the European industry to sell satellite systems. Of course, you see that the satellite trade balance for Japan, China, and Russia over 10 years is very, very small. Again, those are not strong exporters nor importers of satellite systems. The launcher trade balance on the right-hand side is also positive for Europe. Europe creates with its launch activity a net surplus in the trade balance of $120 million a year from our assessment in the past decade. And again, the reason why the surplus is not that good, despite the fact that, as I noted previously, Arianespace must find most of its customers on the commercial and export markets, is because Europe has been acquiring in the past a lot of non-European launch systems, either because they were buying the Soyuz elements to operate in Kourou, which really had a negative impact on the trade balance, of course, but also it was sometimes launching its own programs on US or Russian launchers. We have launched European programs on Proton, for instance, in the past, and we are also often using Falcon 9 to launch European systems. So again, there would be ways to improve this net surplus on launch trade balance by focusing more the use of European launchers when European satellites are concerned. Russia, of course, is really leading on the launcher trade balance on the past decade. This, of course, has become a problem for Russia in recent years due to the sanctions that they are suffering from after the invasion of Ukraine, because they don't access anymore export customers for their launch systems. So clearly, this situation is not going to improve for Russia in coming years. And when we look at the trade surplus that the USA is generating on launch activity, which is in average more or less the same as Europeans, okay? Clearly here we see a trend for growth because of the Falcon 9 good performance and the fact that Falcon 9 is now the leading choice for all commercial space programs that are looking for a launch solution, but not only commercial. So we do expect Falcon 9 to provide more export opportunities for the United States. Eventually, and I would like to conclude here, we add to the trade balance information on spacecraft systems and launch services. We also add the value of equipment and subsystems, which we are either importing or exporting. And here again, we know that we have a positive trade balance on the equipment and subsystem import-export for space satellites, spacecraft and launchers, which is $255 million a year. And again, this is improved by exporting more, but also can be improved if we reduce our dependence from non-European equipments and parts. This is something which is being currently addressed by a number of programs for dependence reductions, which are very much welcome in Europe. We are reducing our imports of electronic components. We are now reducing our imports for propulsion systems and those kind of elements. And this is clearly improving the global trade balance for space systems in Europe. So this is the end of the presentation. I've been a bit long. My apologies for this. And now we open the floor for questions and discussion, if any. Thank you very much.